Panelist is Sienna Baskin. She is an Equal Justice Works Fellow providing legal services at the Sex Workers Project at the Urban Justice Center in New York City. Ms. Baskin provides legal education, advice, and representation to sex workers in New York on a variety of issues and advocates for policy changes onto the state level to improve and build the environment for sex workers. Ms. Baskin also seeks to educate the public on collateral impacts of criminalization of prostitution and works for reform in the law to better protect victims of human trafficking. Sienna is a graduate of Hampshire College and the City University of New York School of Law.
So I was here as a student 2 years ago, so it's very exciting to be back as a panelist. And what I'm going to be talking about is sort of the practical manifestation of a lot of the things that Andrea spoke about. So first, a little bit about the Sex Workers Project. We're a small legal organization in New York City. We've been around since 2001, and we do a lot of different work on this issue. We do provide legal services and representation. We also do legislative advocacy on the local, state, and national and international level on this issue, and we also do research and human rights documentation. So we put out studies on sex work and trafficking. So if you want to intern with us, come talk to me later. So first I'm going to talk about why we focus so heavily at the Sex Workers Project on criminalization, which may be obvious but may not be. When we talk about who sex workers are, what I've discovered through my work is that there's very few generalizations you can make about sex workers. In terms of reasons for doing sex work, in terms of the level of agency they have in making those choices. Kinds of sex work span illegal and legal forms of work, and then people's experiences in sex work all over the board. And those two numbers of how many prostitutes are and how many lawyers there are, don't assume that those are mutually exclusive categories. Lawyers can be sex workers too, and vice versa. So the more you engage with this issue, the more you see how permeable these categories are. But the one experience that almost all sex workers have in common is that they're affected by, maybe in very different ways, but they're affected by criminalization and stigma. So when we talk about decriminalization, which I know is one of the topics that the organizers really wanted to focus on, and it's always an interesting topic for law students and lawyers, what I found is that we have to think about that in a really broad way, because the way that prostitution is features in all aspects of the law, it's not just the criminal law. So I'm going to talk about New York as sort of a case study. I know that not everyone here is from New York, or maybe no one's from New York, but as you know, most law is state law, and criminal law is definitely state law. So a lot of what I'm saying may be applicable in states that you live in, but that's my level of expertise. So first, I'm going to take you through the criminal law in New York and talk about the different problems that come up for people that do sex work. One is that the prostitution law in New York is very vague. It includes, basically the law is written that it's a crime to agree or offer to engage sexual conduct in return for a fee. Sexual conduct is not defined. And it may seem like it has an obvious definition, but there's a lot of acts and behavior that people engage in that are in a gray area of, is it sexual conduct or is it not? And so whenever you have a really vague law, then you start to see discriminatory application of that law. So certain people being affected by it and certain people not being affected by it. One way that manifests that we've seen is people who do work that they think is legal and have always thought is legal, and that's why they're doing it, because it's legal, like fetish work, so professional domination, submission, which people don't think of as involving actual sex acts. But because there's still a lot of stigma against people in that profession, they can be arrested for prostitution and have been arrested for prostitution. And then because of the way the criminal justice system works, they may end up even pleading to something that they didn't commit, because they don't have the level of, they're not in a place to argue that what I did was not sexual conduct. There's other laws that people are arrested for, though. It's not just prostitution. We have a law in New York called loitering for the purposes of prostitution. And that may exist in other states as well, or may have different different language around it, but it's basically a crime that is specifically targeting street-based sex workers, supposedly. So people who are on the street and who are doing a lot of different acts that are legal acts, like waving to a passerby or waving to a car, for the purposes of committing prostitution. And when I talk to sex workers about this, they're like, well, how did the cop know what my purpose was? They didn't ask before they arrested me. So this is a very broad law that can be used to sweep up a lot of people and can be used in profiling. And then there's a lot of other laws around prostitution that people have a lot of different opinions about, and those are the laws against promoting and the laws against basically being a client of a sex worker. And there are different approaches to this issue in different countries, and some approaches say, well, prostitution is a bad thing, but we don't want to criminalize the people who are doing the work. We want to criminalize the people who are exploiting them, and that we think is the promoters and the clients. And what we've found is that even laws that raise penalties for promoting or procuring services of a sex worker primarily are going to affect the sex worker, because the sex worker is the one who's going to have to find their clients and find spaces to do their work. And if the other participants in that activity are being heavily penalized, they may have to take more risks to do that, because those people are going to be harder to find. The other thing is that promoting, we might think of, oh, yeah, that's a pimp, and that's an easy, I know what that is. But sex workers, what we found is sex workers work in a lot of different sort of collaborative and collective ways. So they may help each other find clients, or help each other stay safe, or share skills or information. And those interactions could be seen as promoting. So it's not quite a cut and dry line as you might think it is. Once someone's arrested, the way the criminal procedure law kicks into gear, and just the way it works in court, causes a lot of problems for people as well. For one thing, these prostitution and lording for the purposes of prostitution are the lowest level of misdemeanor in New York. And so they're seen by the criminal justice system as very minor and, not a huge deal kinds of crimes. For that reason, people are encouraged to plead guilty to them. And people also have a lot of reasons why they may want to plead guilty. One is that they may be afraid of any further involvement in the criminal justice system damaging their privacy, or family finding out, or they're being featured in a news article or something like that. They may be afraid of being incarcerated pending a trial or more hearings. And if they're a transgender person, they may be afraid of being incarcerated with people of a gender they don't identify with, which can be really dangerous and scary. Or if they're an immigrant, they may be afraid of being detected by the criminal justice system as an immigrant, and that leading to deportation. So there's a lot of reasons why people want to get out of the system as quickly as possible, which may end up with a plea. Another reason why people are encouraged to plead in New York, and possibly in other states, is that New York currently is playing with the idea that, well, let me back up and say that a lot of these laws are informed by certain perceptions of sex workers, and there's sort of this polarity. There's the idea that sex workers are immoral, and they spread immorality, and they spread disease, and they're vectors of disease, and they're criminals. They're actors in a criminal way. And then the idea that sex workers are victims of crime, that they're being exploited, that they have no agency, and that they're sort of subjects of crime. Both of these are inaccurate and don't really encompass the full reality, but they lead to different aspects of the law. So the idea, maybe sex workers are victims, so let's provide them services through the courts. So you plead guilty to this crime, and then you can go and take part in this wonderful service program and get all these services and see, oh, you can do better with your life, and you can do other things. You don't have to be a prostitute. So that is, some people may benefit from those services. Most of the clients I talk to find them really patronizing and belittling, and especially clients who are falsely arrested for prostitution and don't do prostitution, don't identify as that, don't identify as a sex worker, are like, why are you telling me all this stuff? It's nothing to do with me. I think it's because it comes from this place of, we're going to save you, we're going to help you, and that just doesn't apply to most of these people. And it's encouraging people to plead guilty. The reason that these guilty pleas end up causing problems is because of the ways that prostitution crops up in other areas of the law. So a fun legal research project for any of you is to go to your state, go to your Lexis, and type in prostitution into your state code and just search. And you'll see how prostitution crops up in all these interesting areas of the law that have nothing to do with the criminal law and can cause huge barriers for people. So, collateral consequences of having a criminal conviction. One of the most severe is immigration. So there's historical discrimination against sex workers in immigration law. It's one of the first federal immigration law was to exclude prostitutes from the United States, and that persists till today. So prostitution is on the level of much more serious crimes in terms of it resulting in inadmissibility or deportation from the United States. And so we have clients that are in a situation where they're trying to choose between pleading guilty to something in order to get out of a situation where they may be incarcerated, detected, and put into deportation proceedings, knowing that that guilty plea might then result in them losing status or losing opportunities to gain status in the future. So it's put people in a really hard place. Again, there's an exception for people who can show that they were forced to do prostitution. May apply or be qualified for a visa for victims of trafficking, which is great, and a lot of our clients are able to take advantage of that, of those visas. But it's another sort of example of it's okay if you're a victim, but if you can't prove that you're a victim, then we want to exclude you from the United States. Other areas where it pops up is in housing. So there are laws that are very old laws in New York called the body house laws, which basically enable the courts to bring eviction proceedings against someone who was found guilty of prostitution in an arrest that happened in their home. And these laws probably do exist in other states as well, because they go back to like the 1800s. New York has used these, they're basically nuisance-related laws to not only evict people from their homes, but to sort of stage prostitution arrests at other establishments and try to shut down other establishments like porn shops. It may also have impacts on public housing, having these convictions. So, and then the other obvious example of collateral consequences is employment. So not all sex workers only do sex work for a living. Most have other jobs or other ways of making income. And having convictions or a record for prostitution can lead to discrimination in your other field of work, or loss if you have professional licenses. It can lead to loss of those licenses. So these are some of the impacts that we're seeing in terms of what we're doing to counteract these impacts. And this speaks again to the question of how do we be rebellious lawyers in this field. And one of the main things that we do is we do Know Your Rights workshops, which I provide a lot of this information that I'm providing to you, but it's also a space for sex workers to share skills with each other. Because if you're living in a criminalized state, some of the skills that you have to screen for an undercover police officer, or to screen for a violent client, or to share information with each other is really valuable. And then we also do a lot of work around legislation, and that's both introducing bills that we think may improve this environment and sort of chip away at all these consequences of criminalization, and also keep an eye out for efforts to increase penalties for prostitution and other crimes related to prostitution. So right now there's a bill that would raise, if you're convicted multiple times for prostitution, it would become a higher level misdemeanor, or there may be mandatory sentencing or detention. So fighting against and keeping an eye out for laws like that are coming down. And then just inform and having attorneys talk to each other. So criminal defense attorneys, legal aid attorneys that help people with misdemeanor charges may not be aware of all the collateral consequences of pleading guilty. So having attorneys that do know about those consequences talk to each other is important. And we'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you.